So, we've managed to cover pretty much everything. We've looked into mobile VR and said a couple of words about augmented reality. What can I say? The period around the year 2014 was a busy time for the industry. Now for the real deal. In today's episode, what beef did Gaben have with Oculus? What does Vive mean? How Todd Howard managed to sell Skyrim yet again? Why it was raw as hell? And what does the Ugandan Knuckles have to do with it? As well as random gags, a nice voiceover, and snappy editing. Okay, enough beating around the bush, let's go. A couple of episodes ago, we left Oculus at the point when the company had already managed to release as many as 3 versions of the developer headset. Naturally, no one wanted to keep ordinary players waiting, so the consumer version was actively being finalized. But alas, there's always competition. While Palmer Luckey was filling the information field with Kickstarter campaigns and other entertainment, Valve had been prototyping for a long time, since 2012 to be precise. I'll dive into the details in a separate video. Here, I'll just say that they went through almost the same stages as the Oculus versions. How to track the positions of the head, what to do with low-quality images, why does the headset look so eerie? Well, except for the funding, which didn't have any problems. We are talking about Gaben after all. He doesn't need Kickstarter. The funny thing is that Valve originally weren't planning on releasing their own device. VR is an interesting thing, but excuse me, we already have Oculus dominating everything, so why bother entering the market? As a matter of fact, in January 2014, Valve announced that, we and Oculus are now BFFs and are working together. The results show us that the whole story didn't last long, which presumably had something to do with the sale of Facebook. But that's an open one. Meanwhile, HTC, previously known only for their smartphones, also decided to try and make something VR-ish. They started experimenting, which resulted in the Re-Periscope camera and the Re-Grip handheld camera.
Introducing the all-new HTC Vive camera.
I only need to mention them here for a fun fact about the name of the future product. Correspondingly, it was going to be called Revive, like the verb revive, but the marketing department threw out the nasty re prefix. Now you know the story behind the name Vive. So one company was experimenting with VR, as was the other, both needed expert help, and that's how it all came together. Instead of large-scale coverage of the development, the freshly assembled alliance worked quietly and humbly on improving the quality of their headset, without any scandals or loud details. Of course, not that they tried to hide anything, but the developers did not allow any leaks and discussed the prototypes only on closed forums with other developers. As a result, as noted by the creators themselves, the development process was like a walk in the park. And this is despite the constant experimentation and disagreement to compromises in terms of quality. Long story short, the companies did their best. And on the 5th of April 2016, HTC Vive saw the light of day. Since the time of prototypes and developer versions, the ergonomics have improved a lot, even though the ubiquitous wires still got in the way.
Wire.
Well, the stuffing allowed to run some really good games. And we'll get to them in just a bit. But first, we need to find out what Oculus was up to, right? These guys were also working tirelessly until the market fled to the competitors. And so, on January 6th, 2016, the thunder shook the industry in the form of pre-orders for the first Oculus Rift. It was codenamed CV1, which means consumer version, similar to the DK versions. As for the date of the official start of sales, it's complicated. The date depends on the source. Some say it was a week before HTC Vive, some say a week after. In short, I invite those who witnessed it into the comments. But for now, let's agree that the devices were released simultaneously, give or take. But that's not even the funniest thing. As expected, the first batch was sold out in a matter of minutes, even despite the tricks with the price. The company originally wanted to sell the kits for our favorite price of $300, but that didn't work out, so that'll be $600 please. However, this time I'll stick my beggars around to where the sun don't shine, because it was worth it. For example, the resolution had been increased once again, and Rift could display the picture in decent 1080p. Motion tracking had also become more technological and involved a set of external sensors. Of course, it was still far from perfection. For example, the sensors would often conflict with the furniture in the room. But that's understandable. I mean, how is Palmer Luckey supposed to know that no one had the guts to throw out your grandma's wall unit in 20 years? By the way, there's a story to tell about him too. Get back in the seat. It's gonna be interesting, I swear. So as soon as the they sold out to Facebook shitstorm was over, new hot topics started to come up. Apart from VR, Luckey was also a politically active citizen, and as we know, this can get you in all sorts of trouble. In this case, there was a rumor that Palmer was sponsoring a pro-Trump movement. The passions on this topic boiled over, so Luckey was inches from being cancelled. No one knows the details, but on March 30th, 2017, Palmer Luckey said, "I'm done," and left both Oculus and Facebook. He didn't starve, of course, having turned his attention to his second passion, defense technology. Looking at the inventions of his new company called Anduril, it's even a bit of a pity that the industry has lost such a specialist. But what you and I haven't lost is a whole bunch of cool games that came out in that time period. Developers had much more options and experience in VR, so forget the demos and small games from previous videos. Here, for example, we have a 2015 driving simulator called Project Cars. The developers took the engine on which they had previously made Need for Speed Shift, may its soul rest in peace.
Where am I?
What was that?
Oh my god, I'm so sorry, I just had a nightmare.
Got rid of the failed physics model and made everything as it should be. As a result, the game can impress you with its realism even today. Cars' behavior was believable, the weather not only changed but also had a tangible impact on the gameplay, and the sound design allowed you to focus on the sound instead of just listening to the roar of the engine. So, where games like Forza Motorsport and Drive Club used to dominate, a new leader has emerged. I'd love to say that there weren't any weak sides, but there were. I think the worst thing the game had was the realization of teamwork. After all, Motorsport is a story not just about a skilled driver, but also about mechanics, navigators, engineers, and a whole bunch of people. Here everything looked rather lifeless. But that's if you're picking on things not connected to the core gameplay, because everything about the driving was top-notch. Oh, and the VR support, of course. It all looked even more awesome from within a headset, and let's face it, even a little scary. You wouldn't want to crash into a curb at high speed even in virtual reality. But that's nothing compared to the horror called Dread Holes. Our nameless protagonist was thrown into a dungeon, but unfortunately this story isn't about fucking slaves. It was festering with monsters of all kinds of creepiness, while you had the good old jack shit as a weapon. It's not hard to guess that you had to make your way out of the dungeon. Right away about the main thing, the graphics were mediocre. Even by my moderate standards, the environments looked pretty fake. However, after about 5 minutes of gameplay, the non-photorealistic walls became the last thing that bothered the player. The mazes were confusing as hell, and the presence of aggressive fauna made you look around and hurry. Definitely worth every penny. The only thing that broke the immersion for me was the necessity to run using the controller. Well, by that I mean that first you intuitively jerk to the side, and then you're like, oh crap, I don't have to use my legs to run. However, there was a solution to this problem, of sorts. For example, a company called Virtuix was working on an alternative controller in the form of an omnidirectional treadmill. And in 2015, they managed to present a platform called Omni. This fearsome construction was attached to the victim's torso, locking the poor soul in virtual reality. For example, this way you could play Call of Duty Ghosts. Naturally, both in terms of the size and the price, it wasn't a home controller. Rather, it was a solution for virtual reality clubs, where it is still successfully used. And now it's time for the game, the opportunity to talk about which I personally have been waiting since the first episode. Ladies and gentlemen, here we have Superhot. First things first, it's essentially a first-person shooter, but the time in it goes only when the player moves. If you freeze, everything around you freezes as well. You know, like in the Elder Scrolls when the player is looking through the inventory. On the one hand, it allowed you to say, okay, give me a sec, and think anytime you want. On the other hand, there were always the "ah shit" moments when the player would forget some detail and die. Apparently, the first such detail was the main mechanic of the game. Everything around looked minimalistic, but first, it was stylish, and secondly, it allowed to better perceive the situation. Oh, and all of that had a plot. But honestly, it's impossible to even begin talking about it without spoilers. It's something like Undertale, only without the "Hi, I'm desperately trying to disguise as a regular game" type of intro. So, I can only advise you to go out and try beating Superhot, especially since you can play it even without VR. Though, frankly speaking, I really don't recommend you to play it if you don't have a headset.
And now, behold, dismemberment.
Literally, because here we have Surgeon Simulator. The original version came out back in 2013, but the VR version was already out in 2016, so it's about time we talked about it. Now, what's the best way to describe it? Imagine that you've been boozing your way through medical school for 7 years, and someone thought that letting you do a surgery right away is a good idea. I mean, how hard can it be, right? All you have to do is to carefully saw off this thing here and... oops. Well, I hope he had health insurance. Anyway, you had to get the sequence right and handle the hellish controls all at the same time. If you're not wearing a VR helmet, please accept my condolences. But things weren't exactly easier in the VR version either. So, no surgeons were harmed in the process of writing the script, but I can't vouch for the patients. But there's more, as now we are getting to AAA projects. For example, it wasn't just any game, but the Fallout 4 that got the VR support. Naturally, it was the same fourth part, which within 2 years managed to become loved and hated, and sometimes even both. Yes, it was just a modification, and yes, it had a bunch of flaws, especially at launch. For example, it didn't support Oculus Rift, just a tiny issue. But it was still worth playing, simply because the atmosphere of the VR version was much more interesting. Seeing the wasteland with your own eyes and punching a red cockroach in the face is definitely worth it. The player could move either by teleporting to a chosen point or by walking. And despite a billion ways to mess up the second option, it was actually quite fine. In general, if the VR version didn't have a price tag of a separate game, everything would have been nice. But that's Bethesda, what are we even talking about? And since we are talking about this company, we have to honor their most daring, innovative and groundbreaking project. I'm talking about the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Todd is a simple man. He sees a reason to release Skyrim again, he releases it. All in all, it's literally the same as Fallout. The same raw start, the same strong immersion effect with another speedrun to Sovngarde, and the same morbid full price tag for a modification. I should also say that Skyrim VR still felt a bit raw even after the patches, so I would advise you to arm yourself with a bunch of mods to get the full thrill. The feeling of a dragon flying over your head instead of on the screen will definitely pay off the time spent building the game. It won't pay off the $60, but it will definitely pay off the building process. Perhaps someone finally got through to Bethesda, or maybe its software had tougher guys, but in any case, Doom got an actual separate game. It was called Doom VFR. Despite having a standalone VR version, there was still plenty of reason for the players to complain. The plot was doomishly simple. The protagonist was a scientist in the notorious UAC lab who was slayed by demons, but came back to life and took up arms. But that was more than enough, because first, story is the last reason we play Doom, and second, it was a spin-off. The problems arose where the project tried to go beyond the VR capabilities of its time. The controls weren't particularly convenient for a number of reasons on any of the available platforms. The picture would occasionally say, "Hold up," and try to load mid-play. Certain details of the interface hinted that little thought was given to it. And overall, it was still the same 2016 Doom, even though it was officially made a separate game. So, in itself, Doom in VR was really cool, but its technical realization left much to be desired. But even with all the flaws, it was a full-fledged AAA VR experience that both players and us have been waiting for since the first episode. New technologies allowed things never thought possible. And I'd like to finish out today's video with one more such example. I'm talking about VR chat. Not exactly a game, but officially it is considered an MMO sandbox, which simply cannot be left out. Though it's a bit hard to describe this one. In a nutshell, imagine Minecraft with all its creative possibilities. Now transfer it to the usual, even if not the best graphics, and multiply it by 100. That was exactly the kind of wild creative platform that we got. Here you could take the model of almost any character as your avatar, set up the space as you want, hold an event, create a dumb meme that surpassed even the almighty Amorgus. Long story short, the thing was incredible in terms of its features, especially before the developers introduced an idiotic anti-cheat and killed most of the mods with it. To imagine the release of such a VR monster in terms of flight of fancy in the early 2010s was simply impossible. However, the same can be said for everything in this episode. Technology has finally picked up, and it was only getting cooler. Today I've mostly talked about the games without mentioning which they would have burnt me at the stake. There were many other interesting smaller games like Lone Echo, H3 VR, the list goes on. So here's an excuse to invite you to the comments to share your favorite games from the days of the first Oculus. Don't forget to hit the like and bell buttons while you're at it. In the next episode, we'll continue to observe technological advances and meet another contender of the VR race.